I've owned and lived in the same house for 8 years. It's a normal family-sized home, which was relevant when I had roommates. But when they moved out and it just became me living here, I had nothing to do with the extra space. It was technically a 4-bedroom house, but I only used 2 of the bedrooms. One is my main bedroom and one is the game room. The other 2 rooms were on the far end of the upstairs hallway. One had a few storage boxes in it, and the other was completely empty. After getting out of work at 9 o'clock, I picked up Wendy's on the way home and pretty much went right to the game room. I was off tomorrow, so what better to do than game all night? I put my headphones on and loaded up COD, but before I had time to even load into a match, I thought I heard something that sounded like a knock at the front door. I took my headset off and listened, but not hearing anything and figuring they would have knocked again if there was someone there, I went back to my game. Probably a whole 2 hours went by, and then I heard it again. It sounded like either a knock or a door closing or something like that, but with my headphones on and with my room door closed, it was way too quiet for me to tell. I got up and opened the door, looking out into the hallway and waiting for that sound to come again. After a minute, though, I went downstairs and looked out the front door. Nobody was outside my house, and everything seemed normal. Having been hearing these sounds, though, I obviously made sure the door was locked before going back upstairs. To be a bit more cautious, I left my room door open this time, so if it happened again, maybe I'd hear it better. I put my headset back on and continued gaming. I played through a whole round, so like 20-ish minutes. As the game ended and I leaned back in my chair, a figure rushed past the open doorway, just off to the side of my view. I immediately threw my headphones off and jumped from my chair, horrified and unsure what to do. I just stared at the doorway. I didn't get the courage to finally move for several minutes. When I looked into the hallway, though, and eventually the rest of the house, nobody was there, but the front door was unlocked again. When police came and investigated, it was clear that the person had been hiding and very likely living in the empty room. I hadn't been in there for weeks or maybe even months, so all this time they could have been just on the other side of the wall from me, and I had no idea. It's really scary to think about, especially if I'd happened to confront him. There's no saying what he would have done. It was the middle of the summer. I was 11 years old and my younger brother was 8. We were outside playing various games with other kids in our neighborhood, but we finally headed home as the sun went down. Maybe once a week, our parents would go to a different restaurant around town, leaving my younger brother and me home alone. Most of the time, they'd tell us before they went out, but if we were outside playing, sometimes they'd just leave us to our game. When we got back home and no one was there, we assumed this was the case. Confirming this was a note left on the kitchen counter. My younger brother and I both went to the living room to watch TV, something we usually did before bed. After half an hour, it had gotten completely dark outside. Just then, I heard the doorbell ring, followed by knocking. At first, I thought it was our parents getting back, but it definitely wasn't normal for them to use the front door, much less not have a key for it. The chances of the garage door opener they had not working them for getting a key were extremely low. Although I realized it was still possible, I left the living room and went up to the front door to see who it was. As I approached the door, I heard a man's voice yell that he was selling Girl Scout cookies. I was extremely confused considering the time of day. I looked through the peephole and saw a grown man, completely alone, with no cookies in hand and not with his daughter as I was expecting. The man yelled out once more before moving his hand to the door handle. My heart dropped, realizing that we had forgotten to lock the door when coming in for the night. The door handle slowly started turning, and I quickly engaged the deadlock. A clicking sound echoed out. It was too loud. Clearly, the man had heard it and now knew someone was inside. I waited a minute before once again looking through the peephole. The man was now looking through our living room window directly at my younger brother, who was completely unaware of what was going on. From where he now stood, I could make out a gun holstered on the left side of his waist. I ran back to the living room and closed the blinds. I told my brother we should get some ice cream downstairs in the basement. I needed to get him away from any windows, but I knew that if he knew what was going on, he would freak out. He agreed, and we went downstairs. I silently locked the basement door behind us. We ate our ice cream, and eventually, I could hear the hum of the garage door opening from upstairs, signifying that my parents were back home. Later, when my brother wasn't around, I told them what had happened. They were horrified and understandably called the police. The police inspected the place, and one of the first things they noticed was how the front door's lock had clearly been tampered with, basically confirming the man had ill intent and was trying to break in. What he planned to do when he got inside, though, I can't say for sure, and neither can the police. The man was never identified. To this day, my younger brother doesn't even know this whole event took place. I was 18 when my parents went away on a week-long anniversary trip. My sister had already moved out by this point, so I had to hold the fort. My parents' property is enclosed by woods and a dirt driveway leading to the road. The road is a quiet back road with equally sized properties running alongside it, all of them separated at a decent distance. So it's a really isolated feel up there. Everyone in town knows each other. You see familiar faces all the time, for the most part, at the gas station, the grocery store, the bars, which I'd learn a few years later when I started going to them. Speaking of gas stations, this story starts one day while my parents were away. I was at a gas station filling up my tank when a black Jeep Cherokee pulled up to the pump next to mine. A man with a goatee stepped out, greeted me, and started filling his tank. In that town, it was normal for strangers to greet each other like that. He had his nozzle locked into the gas tank, and then he walked around to my side of the pump and went, "Excuse me, do you know how to get to the interstate from here?" I helped him to the best of my ability. He pulled out a notepad and started writing down the directions I gave him. Very odd how he wouldn't just do that on his cell phone like anyone else would. He thanked me and asked if I'm from the area. I said yeah, I grew up here, and he said he's from out of town. He didn't specify where. He then went back to his side and put the nozzle back in the pump. He then asked my name as he said, "It's nice meeting you." I said, "My name's Aaron." He said, "What a lovely name," and then got in his car. As I got into mine, I drove out first and turned left to go up the road back home. It was only a few minutes worth of driving before I was approaching our turn into the driveway. I slowed down, put my blinker on, and then turned right onto the property. It was at that moment that I noticed the car behind me was that same black Jeep Cherokee. He passed me as I turned into our driveway. He went the complete opposite way that I told him to go to get to the interstate. As he passed me, he didn't slow down or anything, so it seemed that maybe he just forgot the directions I gave him and went the wrong way. I let myself inside and went about the rest of my day doing whatever. I think it was that night that I was going out to meet up with my friends. I stepped outside, walked to my car, and heard the sound of footsteps nearby. Like I said, the house is enclosed by woods, and this was in the middle of the summertime. It could have been any number of animals, so I didn't investigate. I just got in my car and left. But when I got back home hours later and walked from my car to the house, a man's voice from out somewhere in the woods called out, "Aaron." I got the chills as I looked around and then, in a panic, rushed to open the front door. I slammed it shut and sat on the couch to breathe. The neighbors all knew my name, but the houses are not on top of each other, so it's a bit of a walk, and there was no reason for one of them to call my name like that, like a creep, and not identify themselves. I decided to call my parents to tell them, and their explanation was it must have been one of the neighbors and they'll probably knock on the door. I didn't tell them about the encounter at the gas station. The next day, which was a Saturday, I stayed home most of the day. Later that night, I once again was going out to meet with my friends. After getting ready and everything, I went outside, and as I was walking to my car, I heard loud and clear from the not-so-far distance, someone call, "Aaron." Again, this time I didn't wait a second. I ran back inside the house and locked the door. Again, I called 911, this time texting my family while doing so. After 2 cops showed up to the house, they looked around the perimeter of the property with their flashlights, then came back and said to call again if this persisted. I didn't feel much better after this. It's not really like they did much. Going outside until the next day when I had work, I was a server at a nearby restaurant. I was working a late shift. I left the house in broad daylight, paranoid to hear that voice again. Thankfully, though, I didn't. Maybe seeing the police car finally scared them off. After many hours at work, I was ready to go home and collapse into bed. I pulled onto the property, parked my car out front, and walked to the front door. I stopped when I heard the sound of footsteps again. It didn't sound like an animal's footsteps, though. I stood on the front deck for a second, waiting, and then that familiar voice yelled out again, saying, "Aaron, don't call the cops on me again." "Cutie," I yelled out, "you need help, you're sick," and let myself inside. I called the cops once more, and the cops came again, searched the perimeter again, and left. My parents told me I should stay at a friend's house for the night. I couldn't agree more. They would be back the following night, so after that, I would feel much safer being there. My friend Fidelia told me I could stay with her that night, so I packed a bag and was ready to go. I checked out the windows first to make sure the coast was clear. I then went outside and locked the door as fast as I could, then ran to the car. As I turned the key in the ignition, I heard something right to my left. Right outside the driver's side door was a man wearing a face mask trying to open the door. I couldn't even scream. I felt like I was choking on air. As I put the car in drive, he started hitting the glass with his elbow. I looped my car around on the grass and sped down the driveway, and I turned right up the road and didn't stop until I got to Fidelia's house. I was hysterically crying the whole drive there, as I had Fidelia and her dad on the phone with me. He said he would have come and picked me up had he known the situation. We called the police together for a 3rd time in total. A couple officers went to my parents' house to investigate again, make sure no windows were shattered or anything. One officer came to Fidelia's house, where I once again gave my description of what happened. This was probably the most action these cops had seen in a long time in this quiet town. Thankfully, my parents came home the next day, and I felt safe staying at home again. I fully believe the man at the gas station followed me home intentionally and scoped the place out, realizing I was by myself and, for whatever reason, toyed with me until he actually tried to pounce and get me. I shouldn't have given my real name, and I should have been more alert to my surroundings and realized he was following me in my car that day. Some people are nuts and have way too much time on their hands. This incident was a huge motivating factor in my moving out to my own apartment a few months later. I'm an only child and grew up in a small town. My parents were hardworking, often struggled to pay the bills, so they usually worked a lot of overtime or even had multiple jobs. Because of this, I was left home alone pretty frequently. I was 13 at the time, and this night both my mom and dad were working closing shifts, so I was at home by myself after school until 10 or 11. To keep myself busy, I'd usually watch TV or go for walks in the woods behind our house. After getting home from school and having a snack, I went outside and started walking along my regular path while the sun was still out. It was a 2.5 mile trail through the woods that almost never had anyone else walking on it. Strangely though, about a mile into the walk, I saw a guy on the trail up ahead. He was sitting with his back against a tree, wearing a dark blue jacket and had a red baseball cap tilted downward, covering his eyes and most of his face. From the way he was slumped over, it almost looked like he was sleeping. So I continued walking, trying to quietly pass by him. As I got just a couple of feet away, though, he lifted his head and instantly locked eyes with me. His eyes were tired and red, and he had this disturbing frown like he was upset or something. As I passed by, he started standing up, and getting a strange feeling about him, I began walking faster, basically jogging the rest of the trail and back home. I didn't see him follow me, but I locked all the doors just in case. Again, I was only 13, and even though I was used to being home alone, I still got scared pretty easily. I stayed inside and checked the windows one last time before trying to distract myself by watching TV. Only a few minutes after turning it on, though, I heard a voice at the back door. I paused the TV and listened, hearing a man call out multiple times, repeating the word, "Hello." I stood up and looked down the main hallway. That same guy with the red cap and blue jacket was standing at the back door, almost pressing his face into it as he tried to look inside. I quickly went back around the corner, but he must have seen me because he immediately stopped calling out and instead started trying to force the door open. I just froze up in the middle of the living room, listening to the door jolt back and forth against the lock. After several attempts, though, he left. I called my parents, and they called the police, but he was never found. Having been followed home and them trying to break in, though, I can only imagine what they were trying to do to me. My friend Basil and I rent a house together. He's a pretty big partier, though, and often stays out really late or even sleeps over at others' places, so a lot of nights I have to myself. This was one of those nights where Basil was out at the club or something. So, having the night alone, I brought out a couple cans of beer to our front porch and sat on the swinging bench we had set up. It was nice weather out, and with it being nearly midnight, most people were sleeping, and the neighborhood was pretty quiet. After being out for a little less than an hour, a person came walking down the street in front of the houses. He looked like a large guy and had a sweatshirt on with a hood over his head, but something was off about the way he was walking. He was very stiff, like only his legs were moving, and his whole upper half wasn't. When he got up to the part of the road my house was in front of, he stopped and looked over at me. I waited a few seconds for him to say something, but he didn't say anything. He just stood there in the middle of the road, right in front of my house, and looked at me. "Hey buddy, you need something?" He stayed quiet for a moment, then started walking up my driveway. I stood up from the bench and yelled at him to leave, but once I realized he was getting pretty close, I hurried inside and locked the door behind me. I then watched out the peephole as the guy came right up to the door. He waited for another second before pulling out something from under his sweatshirt. It was hard to see from the small view I had, but it looked like maybe a hammer or crowbar or something. Once I saw that, I knew what was likely about to happen. I ran upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom, dialing 911 and trying to be quiet. I could hear the wood splintering off the door downstairs as I pleaded with the operator for help. Then there was a loud thud and silence. The broken door swaying on its hinges was the only sound. I waited anxiously, only assuming that I'd hear the guy's footsteps approaching the bedroom door at any second. But seconds turned to minutes until I heard a cop car pull into my driveway. I thought about running down to the officers, but the operator suddenly told me through the phone to stay where I was and wait for the cops to get to me. So, I sat back down. 30 seconds later, I heard one of the officers walking up the stairs, followed by them shouting and firing off a taser. The guy had been standing right outside the bedroom door, as if he was just waiting for me to open it. He was arrested and apparently was very drunk, but I have no clue who he was or why he did what he did. As far as the officers have told me, the guy wouldn't even say why he was walking down the road or what he was even doing there. All I know is if I had opened that door, it would have been the last thing I ever did. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.